All right, we're going to briefly go over implementing and managing interpreters. I boiled this down to some do's and don'ts. As I pointed out last year, in order to get good at it, you have to practice it. So every opportunity you have when you get over there, you should take that. Go ahead. So some things that you need to insist that your interpreter do here. Speak in the first person. It's really easy for us a lot of times, but they may have a tendency to say, like, he wants me to ask you or whatever. They should speak as you speak. So if I say, what is your name? They should ask the other person exactly, what is your name? Remain in close proximity when you're speaking. That's really important because even though you're trying to talk to that person, they're probably not going to look at you. They're going to be looking at the interpreter, but you always need to maintain eye contact with your subject and remain in close proximity. It doesn't really do much good for me to be trying to use an interpreter to stand next to me when the person I'm trying to talk to is over there. Okay. Carry a notepad and take notes. That's super important just because as you glean information or when they answer your questions, you need to write down pretty much verbatim the way that the interpreter said it back to you. Ask when you're not sure of a term or phrase. I also put up concepts and acronyms on there. Across cultures, there's different ideas or concepts that don't translate well into other languages. So if you're not sure of something, always ask. And then project clearly and mirror both and your vocal stresses and overall tone. So when you make a voice inflection or use body language, the interpreter should reflect that also when interpreting that across to the other person. Next slide. Okay, so big ones are the things to do as the speaker. So refrain from becoming engaged in a tangent or dialogue. Don't become an advocate for a certain thing or mindset or idea or decision. Don't become a mediator in a dispute. Don't do that. So basically it just says don't be an advocate. Try to spend a little time with the interpreter before the event begins. It's really important to build a rapport with your interpreters. The more you work with them, the more you build that working relationship, the more comfortable you're going to be, the more comfortable they'll be. They'll also be able to know what you mean when you say certain things. The interpreter we had about halfway through that came to us, he knew English really, really well. He spent a lot of time growing up, hanging out with Americans and got the job as an interpreter. The more and more time we spent with him, fewer questions he had to ask to get our point across because he already knew what it was that we were trying to figure out. So building that rapport and that working relationship is super important. When possible, prepare the interpreter on the subject matter to be presented or discussed. That more goes along the lines of if you're giving a formal presentation. So if you were in this room and there were foreign nationals or multinationals in the room and you're having to utilize an interpreter, be sure that each of the interpreters you're using is already familiar with the material and the ideas or concepts. Ascertain the interpreter's frame of reference and then be cognizant of his or her ability to deal with military concepts. What that means is just because somebody's been working with the U.S. forces for a long time doesn't mean they're familiar with things or even simple concepts like the idea of a platoon or a company, battalion. They may not be able to translate that well because they don't understand it. They don't get how that force structure is. And then always advise the interpreter in advance of your audience or interlocutor. I can't even say that word. What it means is if you have formal people in the room that have a title like doctor or mister or general, make sure that your interpreters know that so that and then identify those people. So that way when they're talking to them, they can use those titles. Sometimes we don't think of that as being super important, like, oh, Dr. So-and-so, big deal. But in a lot of cultures, that's a really big deal that they have that title, they've been granted that title, they carry that title. So make sure that if you are doing something formal, especially like a presentation like this, they can identify those people. Next slide. Okay, maintain eye contact with your audience. Again, I'll go back to what I said on the first slide. If you're talking to somebody, even when they're not looking at you, be looking at them. It's not just respectful, but it also lets you ascertain their mood and their body language and notice little things. Okay. Always speak in the first person. So trying to think of an example. So if you're going to ask them something, I would say to them, rather than tell the interpreter, ask him what he wants me to do. I would say, what do you want me to do? Okay? And that's what the interpreter is going to ask. He's going to say, what do you want him to do or want me to do? Okay? If he does it right, like we talked about on the previous slide, talking in the first person, he will say, what do you want me to do? Now, understand that you may or may not know if he did that the way you expected him to or not, but if you worked together with him before and built that rapport and sat down and said, hey, I want you to say it exactly like I say it, then he should be doing that. Speak in short thought groups and pause for your interpreter. So there's two different kinds of interpretation. There's concurrent and consecutive. So the DoD prefers to use so you can have something translated in real time, usually using like automatic earbuds. You've probably seen a lot of advertisements for some of those technologies where while somebody's speaking, it's talking into your ear, right? So that's concurrent. So as they're speaking, there's a little bit of a lag, but it's interpreting it for you. DoD prefers a system, and the Department of State prefers a system where you use these short thoughts and phrases to ask a question or pose a thought, and then allow the interpreter time to interpret it back. Okay? So you have to give your interpreter enough time to process what you said, and then interpret it back, receive the information, and then interpret it back to you in our language. Okay? So if you give them a long run-on sentence or a big stream or want them to figure out too many things at once, then you're going to have a hard time getting information. The other thing that makes that really helpful is if you're trying to go down a rabbit hole or you're trying to follow a train of thought, that gives you time to think of the next thing based off their response. So there's several times where I would be thinking to myself, okay, if he tells me this, then my follow-on question is going to be this. But if he tells me something different, my follow-on question is going to be this. So use that same opportunity to develop your next line of interpretation, okay? Next slide. Refrain from using pedantic vocabulary, acronyms, idioms, slangs, etc. We have a lot of things in our culture as Americans and our microculture in the Army, especially acronyms that we understand innately, right? Like if I told you METTC, you know exactly what I'm talking about, okay? But somebody else outside of the Army culture is not going to understand that, even in the American culture. So when you cross multinational borders, that's not going to translate into another language. So you literally have to spell out every single concept that you want. And that seems very monotonous and tedious, but it's the only way you're going to get an effective interpretation, okay? So yeah, just stay away from anything that's kind of insider culture. Be attuned to the flexibility of the interpreter. How do I explain this? So sometimes you're going to get interpreters that may or may not be from there, and that may or may not be their first language. So I only know English, that's what I know. Okay? So if I have an interpreter, I'll use my personal experience. We actually had one who was from Afghanistan, but he was from a different region that had different dialects and used a different language as its primary language. Okay? Pashto he learned, but it wasn't his primary. And a lot of times the people he would be talking to, in one particular instance at a media station, the guy was from Iran. And so he was also speaking Pashto as a second language. So there's a flexibility limit there where neither one of the two people are communicating in a language that is their primary language and that is super comfortable for them. And then your interpreter has to give that back to you in another language that's not his primary or comfortable language. So you need to be attuned to the flexibility of your interpreters, and you have to watch out for those cross-cultural isms that tend to crop up, okay? Be constantly attuned to the audience's comprehension level. They may not understand the material that you're trying to present at all. Again, back to frame of reference, they may not understand it. So it helps if you have preparation time to figure out what they already know and exactly what it is you need to communicate. Okay? Next slide. Be attuned to varieties of dialects. So again, I'm going back to the multicultural thing, right? So here, we have our own dialects in a very large piece of land in this country. But places like Europe are a lot smaller. The same amount of time it takes to drive from here to Fairbanks, you can cross 5 countries. Okay, so there's a lot more bilingual or multilingual people, but the dialects vary dramatically even inside of just one country, just as it does here. We all speak Imperial English, but it's variations wherever you go. And then plan on 10-minute breaks for about every hour of interpretation, give the interpreter and audience time to rest. Most of my experiences in interpreting are pretty casual, like in passing. Never did anything really formal, like trying to present something via visual aids or written material. So if you are doing something formal, it is going to be a block of time. For every hour, you need to block in 10-minute blocks of time for a break. And then rotate interpreters. As you start to work with interpreters, you'll get more comfortable with ones that you like or that do well and work well with you. But they need a break too, just like you do. Because it's mentally exhausting having to do that back and forth across 2 or 3 languages. So when you plan in those breaks, at each break, if able, you should rotate the interpreter that you're going to be using next. Okay? Next slide. Yeah, so that just goes into don't burn out the same interpreter. Okay? Over-depending on that interpreter can burn them out, and it just wears them out. Be aware of meal times. Those are the most difficult times for an interpreter to work. They have to eat too, because everybody is eating, right? And they want to eat too, but if they're sitting there interpreting, they're talking about 3 times as much as everybody else in the conversation. And that's kind of weird, but they are. So give them those break times, be cognizant of meal times, and try to arrange seating so that it's the most convenient for them, but reduce the amount of actual speaking that has to be done so that they also get an opportunity. And then in those cases, allow them to get away from that group and somebody else to come in and interpret more frequently. You'll just have to rotate more frequently. And then don't ever distract the interpreter by passing notes, whispering, or carrying on side conversations. Especially on the side conversations, don't assume that the person that you're speaking to, that the interpreter is speaking to with you, don't ever assume they don't know what you're saying. I guarantee you, Afghanistan, we've been there 20 years. There's kids that are now teenagers going on adults in their culture. They understand what you're saying. They know exactly what's coming out of your mouth. They're not gonna talk to you in English because maybe they can't or they choose not to. Okay? So don't ever assume they don't know what you're saying, and don't carry on side conversations where they might be able to overhear that. Don't distract the interpreter with passing notes. If you need to give him information, you can step aside, or if you feel like he's not asking the right questions because the answers you're getting back and the information you're getting back isn't correct, you can have him stop for a second. Y'all can converse off to the side, figure out where you're trying to get to so that you're on the same page again, and then come back. Okay? And then the whispering thing that's pretty much disrespectful in every culture, especially in a situation like that. So just don't do it. Next slide. So I mentioned visual aids earlier, especially for formal presentations. You should always practice and rehearse with your interpreters ahead of time, however many you choose to use. That way they're aware of all the materials. Visuals can be helpful, but you also have to be cognizant of how they're going to interpret that back to people. If people have questions about certain visuals, how they're going to explain that. Okay? Beware of telling jokes. My rule is don't tell jokes. Don't do it. Because every single joke that you know is rooted in culture. Okay? Whether it's somebody else's culture or our culture, every joke you know is rooted in an innate understanding of a concept unique to a culture, whatever it is. Does not translate. It doesn't. So don't do it unless it's well rehearsed and well practiced and deliberate. Okay? Don't ever assume that your audience is wholly ignorant. Again, that they don't know what you're saying. Refrain from unofficial comments. So a lot of times we think stuff to ourselves and then we say them out loud, like, oh, this dude, he's lying. You know, don't say stuff like that, okay? Because, again, they may know what you're saying, and the interpreter may not realize you don't want him to accuse the other guy of lying, okay? That can always turn out bad. Always take the time to provide your interpreter with feedback after. That's super important. A lot of times we come back on mission after we had something formal or sit down or went out somewhere. We say, hey, really good job, man. Got all the information we needed. Appreciate it. Or we come back and say, hey, next time if you're struggling, ask us for clarification. That way we can help get you where we need to be. So always give them feedback when you're done, whether it's they did a great job or they need to improve a little bit, or like, hey, dude, you really need to work on your English. I had a hard time understanding what you were trying to get back to. Or, you know, if you need help because this dude is in a different dialect that you don't understand, let us know so we can grab the other guy right quick. Don't try to sit there and get through it. So whether they're doing really well or they need a whole lot of help or somewhere in between, always give them feedback. Next slide. So just a couple of cautionary notes. Interpreting provides an immediate understanding of the spoken word in another language, not to be confused with translating, which is transcribing something out of written text. Bilingual does not equate to being effective as an interpreter, okay? Like I said, I only know Imperial English. I don't know any of the other romantic languages or Germanic languages, but a lot of times, just because somebody can speak it doesn't mean they're going to be able to rapidly or effectively take what somebody else is saying in a language they know, translate it in their head, and then give it back to you correctly. It takes a lot of formal training. And then interpreting may be simultaneous or consecutive. So that's just what I mentioned before. And then Department of State prefers consecutive as opposed to simultaneous. Next slide. Cultural awareness and sensitivity. So both you and the interpreter must stay attuned to this, but don't fall prey to condescension. Oh, God. Okay. So that just goes back to what I was saying. Don't insult the people that you're talking to. They probably know what you're saying anyway, and they're going to pick up on your body language and your tone. Okay. Be aware of the culture that you're in. Be respectful of it. They'll typically be respectful of you. But that's on the culture thing. Be aware of your interpreter's culture too, whether they share that same cultural identity, especially in a small multinational area, with the person they're talking to, because they may not be respectful of the other person's culture, especially in a place like Kosovo where we're going now. The whole conflict is over lack of respect for each other's culture. So they could end up interacting with people that they don't like and don't share values with. But it's super important that you know that ahead of time and keep that in check. If consecutive interpreting is to be used, you'll need to double the amount of time needed to speaking on in English and plan accordingly. That's just saying however much time it would take to have a conversation in English, you need to double the amount of time if you're going to do consecutive interpretation, which is you say something and then they interpret it, okay? So a 1 hour presentation becomes a 2 hour presentation. If your interpreter doesn't look good, you don't look good. So if they make a fool out of you, it makes you look like a fool, okay? So that's where we go back to the rapport, building that relationship, rehearsing ahead of time, and making sure that your interpreters are on the same page. Are there any questions?